Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Explicit Measure podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. Hello, everyone. Welcome back.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks for the welcome. Glad to be here. Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me back.
First time caller.
First time caller, long time listener. There it is. Excellent.
Jinx.
Yeah, jinx. So real quick, I just want to get a couple things out of the way here for a couple intros as we get going here today. First and foremost, this is a recorded episode, so thank you all for participating and jumping in. Sorry.
Last one.
We wouldn't normally wear loud, flashy sweatshirts in a live podcast. We would, however, in a recorded one. So you get some interesting colors on the viewership who's watching on YouTube. So
I'm representing Christmas, and I'm representing at the same time my Italian cultural heritage, Buon Natale.
Yeah, there we go.
Thank you.
Yeah, love it. Enjoy
and in
it.
case you need an idea for your tacky sweater Christmas party,
Red's a good color on you, Tommy. It's a good color.
Appreciate that.
That's good. Yeah. So other quick intros. We are partnering up with SQL Bits this year. Great conference. I'm hearing a lot of good feedback, how much people love the conference. It's the best one of the year they like going to. So I'm hearing a lot of good things. Wish I was going. I wasn't able to make it this year. They didn't choose my session, sadly, but that's okay. There's always another year. So it's at the ICC Wales location. It's going to be March 14th through the 18th. And if you want 5% off, use Power BI Tips 5 for 5% off your tickets and coupons. There will be a free Saturday that anyone can attend. So with that, with all the announcements, let's do a couple little intros here. So I want to go really briefly here on one of the articles around this new unified virtual core or vCore setting that Microsoft has recently announced. The blog article was made by Chris Novak. It's talking about the idea of premium cores and how, when you would buy a premium core, there was this whole concept of a front end versus a back end core and all this kind of stuff and how they're handling that. I read the article and I was confused. I didn't quite understand it. And I didn't, it's probably because there is something assumed in the article that was not written that I just didn't glob onto. So at initial glance, when you look at what they're doing, there are little pretty pictures in here. They're like, oh, by the way, when you buy a P1 core or P1 SKU, you get 4 backend cores and you get 4 front end cores, whatever that means. Backend is rendering like data things. Front end is rendering the UI for whatever your Power BI reports or dashboards are doing, right? So in the legacy model, they would communicate you had 0.5 cores in the back end, 0.5 cores in the front end. In this new unified cores, they're just calling it 1, right? So in a P4 level, you have 8 cores total, 4 back end, 4 front end. Great, happy. When they did this math here on this example they have an example in here that I just did not understand. And I thought at first, I read it once, I was like, I'm stupid. I just don't get it. Maybe I'm just missing something. So I just let it go. And then I saw Marco Russo comment on it. And he's like, this sounds interesting. And his kind of end of the comment was, this seems, as we can say, looks a little creative. So it seems like there's some interesting math being done here. So the crux of it is when you read this section around the before unified cores section and after unified cores. So I just want to pause there for a second. Did you guys read the article? Does this make sense to you? Or did you have the same hang up that I did? I had 4 cores. That's the capacity I was managing. And then at some point, they talk about this unified cores thing. And the job that would have taken me 60 seconds now takes me 120 seconds of compute. I didn't understand. It just didn't make sense to me.
I think there's...
all I'll say is when one of your headlines is simplifying our approach to capacity, and there's this much confusion about the use
simplification process
after.
Womp, womp, womp.
I don't know. I'm still confused. I don't know if it's saying I had legit like either it's saying like I only had 60 what are they saying?
Yeah. So let me give you the numbers here.
60 seconds of compute in the old, but I have 120 seconds available to me now in the 30-second evaluation window.
So like, this is what,
this is what would make sense, I guess.
So here's how I read it. So they're saying in the unified core, before the unified virtual cores, every time you would have a job running, you would run an execution job and you would be evaluated on how much compute you consumed in a 30-second time period. So, for example, a P1 capacity could provide 120 seconds of compute over 4 backend cores. So each one had a 30-second evaluation period, whatever that may be. If you had a hypothetical workload, okay, something that's going to be using that compute, makes sense. It's going to take 60 seconds to compute all of that stuff, whatever that may mean. In the old method, you had an availability of 120 seconds of compute. 60 seconds is half of that. Therefore, your workload consumption was 50%. Okay, makes sense. Then they go over to this new situation where they say after the unified vCores, you still have 8 virtual cores, but it now yields 120 seconds of compute. And this is where my mind doesn't quite make sense. So they say the 120 seconds, so you have all 8 cores being utilized for this, 240 seconds now, and you would have assumed the same 60 seconds of compute would also be 60 seconds of compute in the new world after the unified vCores. But they don't explain that in the article. They say your compute now goes from 60 seconds up to 120 for the same
Sounds worse.
code.
Yeah.
So I don't understand. Like,
Wouldn't it go the opposite way?
that's what I'm saying. It would still be 60.
Well,
And instead of using 50% of my capacity, I would only be using 25%. So I think as I thought about this, and I literally slept on this overnight thinking, what does this mean? And I woke up and thought, maybe I was always using 120 seconds of compute. It was the fact that I was only managing, or Microsoft was only exposing to me the back-end computing side. So what they don't make in this article is, hey, every time you use 30 seconds of compute on the back end, there's an assumed equivalent 30 seconds on the front end that you're equivalently using because you're rendering the visuals as well. So like, you have a back-end core and a front-end core, but now I have the new question of, okay, well, if we're talking about unified cores experience, how like in my mind here, I'm thinking, well, now I get more seconds. What can I do to optimize that core amount so I can just use more of it more efficiently? It's like, I don't, anyways, that's kind of where I'm at. I don't understand the concept of back end, front end. I think they probably made a boon of someone was trying to say something, and
if they use the word like extending vCores, then maybe that's a little different. But I'm reading this instead of simplifying. I'm reading this going, where did I do this in statistics?
Yeah,
like,
this is miss on my point.
And
either way, by the time of this podcast, it'll be out there already because they're launching the update 12.7.
There you go.
So maybe there's some chat going on right now.
I'm relying on Chris Webb for an article on this.
What's going on?
Come on, Chris Webb.
Yeah, because he
pulls out an article here. Do it.
And don't say simplifying because
we need your help. We're lost. Anyways, I just wanted to point that out. It seems confusing. I wish they did a better job explaining in this article what was going on here. So I think they need there'll probably be another article now. Now that Microsoft listens to our podcast, all 2 of them
all the time. Yeah.
So they'll probably issue an update or revise this at some point so it's clearer. So
you just notation, please, be due to EMP.
Due to the podcast, that was amazing. We have decided to clarify the verbiage.
Thank you for calling us out.
Anyways, all right. So moving on to our actual topic of the day. So the actual topic of the day is talking about design concepts inside Power BI reports. So the article for today is why business intelligence needs a Figma design system. I think it's a really good article. Honestly, I think this is a best practice. People need to learn this kind of stuff. I think this really polishes the rough edges around your report. And frankly, as much as valuable as this is something that should be built into the tool, frankly, I think.
Well, I think the article that will be in the episode, and we'll make sure to post it live. This is, I think, extending beyond just your normal visual reports too. When the article says, does business intelligence, it's on bip.pro, why business intelligence not reporting needs a Figma design system. So we've talked about design a lot, but I think there's an extension here of just the concepts of what we do in the BI world. Obviously, the prototyping, the wireframing is a big part of that. But I think there's a design concept that we need to do better to communicate with others.
Well, I totally would agree with you. I think the article does a really good job later on talking about what is the advantage of Figma. Figma, and again, there's another one, Adobe. I'm going to call it Adobe Express, but that's the wrong one. What's the other one that they're from Adobe? Adobe XD. So a Figma and Adobe XD are more like app development tools where you can grab graphics and make basic shapes, image objects on a report canvas.
Tools.
Yeah, designer tools. Yeah, these are for Mac users, right? These are the Mac users of the world. So you can design things and you make this thing called like a component, a reusable component, right? If I have a button or an icon that looks like this, it may have different colors or shades, but I can make different versions of that button or element. So you basically can define basically a visualization standard. And I call this in when I talk with clients about this, I talk about a style guide. Let's build a style guide for your report. These are the ways you build things inside your report. And then it also talks about like, helping you do wireframing. Here's rough samples and layouts of the diagrams. Here's some prototyping you can do, prototype it like this, building the report elements or components, and then helping you produce documentation around the report as well. What are you guys' thoughts?
I think what's interesting is in our Tuesday podcast, where it kind of dovetails into this, where you were talking about a grayscale that you use to not confuse users. And
correct.
Like there's some relevance where you have to bash through like measures and metrics and like make sure you're tying out numbers and things like that. But at the same time, tools like this, I think are super important or very useful, I should say. And I agree with the author from the standpoint that like ramping up and learning how to use them potentially is there's a value add.
Yep.
Because you can convey those layout conversations and like filters and slicer, like all of the things that you would add on a report page can be a conversation in generics.
Yep.
Versus people getting hung up on color. Right? Like, I don't like that red. It's like, ignore the red. That's a default color, right? Like, we're not talking about colors right now.
Yes.
I can't pass green. Like, you shouldn't have yellow. This isn't accessibility, okay? We're talking about layout of visuals on the page.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
is the data right? If I did some of sales here, does that make sense?
These tools shine because they are generic, right?
Yes.
Like, they are just the wireframing tool by which we can say, like, hey, you're landing on this page. You're this user. Here's the difference between this audience and this audience, or this page and that. Let's talk through the page and what would be on here and what we're going to show, and like all the business meaning behind the visualization without showing the visual. Right?
I would agree with that 100%.
So
your thoughts? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm going to make the argument that Power BI may be a better wireframing tool than Figma, and I'll give my reasons why. But I do want to briefly touch on the powerful part for me of the article. Hold on, is the idea of using Figma for personas, for the exporting elements and documentation, and that's where really the more powerful feature of using design system. So let's backtrack then and talk about why Power BI is maybe a better design or prototyping system than something like Figma. And because I've done this with Figma and XD, the powerful feature about Power BI, another thing that we did talk about in our previous podcast, is we have open to us an incredibly powerful technology from the reusability point of view and the ability to be flexible to change things that typically you needed a design system for in the first place. And fact one here is usually if you're building an application, if I'm building an OS for, let's say, for an iPhone, you can't just randomly just design that interface and then remove it. You needed the design tool to showcase what it would do. Or if you're building a website, it's a lot harder, or was a lot harder, just to build up the components on a website. You usually had to show the design first because you had to build all the code.
Sure.
We live in a world now with Power BI that I can easily showcase the visuals and remove them, and I don't have to be tied to whatever's on the canvas, because I can remove it, add the filters or add the colors in seconds and minutes. And that's where Figma really comes into play. But we don't have that hurdle. We don't have that barrier to showcase showcase the design with Power BI.
Well, I mean, I do agree with that level. I do think there is. So I feel like in some cases when it is a good design time to use the Figma or XD, right? I feel like I like to think about the design of the report in two different layers. There's the modeling and there's the visuals, what needs to be in those elements. And then there's like the stylizing of it, right? And the stylizing portion is what I think I like to put inside the Figma. Power BI is not good for roughing out, hey, these are where the objects are need to be. This is where I'm going to put the menu bar. Here's what the menu bar would look like maybe. Here's the icons I'm going to use. Like Power BI is just not good with those things. If I could literally, if Power BI would let me drag and drop visuals or images into the report canvas and just like, how hard could that be?
Yeah.
I should be able to go to my desktop, grab an icon or an image and just drag it into Power BI desktop. And it should know, hey, you're trying to grab an image and put it in the Power BI file. I shouldn't need to have to go click insert image, click a file, go grab the stuff and then have it imported. It should just be smart enough to know that I'm dragging an image in, or if I copy a screenshot from some other place and I paste it into the Power BI desktop file, it should just acknowledge that I'm pasting an image, a PNG or whatever, right into the desktop. It should just do it. So that's the advantage, I think, of these other tools, because if I'm using other tools, I'm going to the internet or I'm getting some ideas or I'm getting like a theme image that I'm going to use to base my design off of. And one thing that Power BI is not good at is reusable components. We have groups which could technically be used as a reusable component. But again, the way that these reusable components work in other tools, they're just way better than what Power BI Desktop does. And if Power BI Desktop could act like Figma in that way, grouping things, aligning stuff, like Figma has this really interesting concept of if you group 3 images together or 3 objects together, when you stretch that box, that bounding box, you can define per image, how does that image relate to each edge or corner of that bounding box? So is it automatically centered? Am I automatically matching the top height and the bottom height and letting the edges stretch? Or like there's a whole bunch of reusable component like things that Figma does that I think Power BI could take some notes from. But
Which
again,
is incredibly ironic because you can copy a visual from Power BI as an image somewhere else.
That's true. Yeah, you can get out of it with images, but you can't get it in.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so maybe let's backtrack then. So what's the purpose from the wireframing then? Like what are we trying to communicate? Because ultimately we're trying to communicate something, whether it be Figma, when we're doing a wireframe. What's the core communication?
Before we backtrack, I kind of wanted to pitch over to Seth. Like we talked about, like, you know, Tommy was thinking like, hey, this is, you know, we have this tool, the technology to like quickly prototype stuff, right? Throw things away. We may get rid of it. Okay. Like, where do you land on this, Seth? Like, where do you feel like, should Power BI be the tool for wireframing and quick prototyping? Or would you want to do more of that work in another tool where, you know, I don't know. I'm kind of curious your spot on this as well.
I just want to disagree with Tommy. So no, I don't think Power BI is
One
the right place. I think it depends, right? Like it depends on the type of report or who I'm engaging with that I would introduce something like Figma. And the reason I say that is there's a lot of like really fast ad hoc kind of stuff that we throw together for internal use, and it could be to just meet a need, right? Like we talked, is it paginated? It's a data dump. Is it somebody who doesn't know or understand, you know, what they need, but like will aggregate some of the metrics and then there's a table. But on the flip side of that, right, I think there's 2 things that come out of mind using the tools like this. One is, if you think about how you would introduce reporting from, you know, like I don't think it's relevant from a ad hoc user perspective, like your users that are just creating their own stuff. This is purely in the BI space where you're creating company-wide stuff that you would potentially want to standardize, have templates. This makes sense to me as well as like big projects that might be customer facing, right? Where parts of those conversations are what is the user experience of the particular audience related to the information that we're trying to convey to them.
Yeah.
And that design conversation and that experience conversation is much better in a tool like Figma from my perspective, because you can branch the things out. It starts at this page, and this is what happens when you right click and go through, and it like there's a flow in the same way that we talk about process diagrams or using other tools to
I like that.
visualize what something is going to be doing. It simplifies that conversation and keeps it relevant only to the thing that we care about, which is what is the end user experience. And the design along with that is like, okay, here on this page, we're going to have this selector. This is how they're going to navigate. We're going to have some buttons that go blah, 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 blah. You know, like trying to do that in the development tool to create it doesn't make sense to me, because you don't get the same overall single view of like what a tool like Figma can do, or whatever like charting mechanism you're using to convey those thoughts and talk about. It's like, okay, well, our executive team is going to view this like, well, let's start it down here, like from the bottom up, right? Our analysts, we're going to produce them these reports. They're going to allow them to like drill in and then dump out the data because they're going to want to analyze it in this way, blah blah blah. And then we have this page, which is for the management layer, where what we're doing is we're aggregating from, like the design of the page is going to be different because here's how the users are going to interact. And this is how we want them to project, like going through those processes with tools like this, like bring up conversations that I don't think I've ever had in just like presenting like first rev version of a Power BI report, or trying to like do something like this in Power BI, because it's a development tool for all intents and purposes. We're building the actual objects on the page, whereas I think Figma and design tools do what they should, which is prompt design, audience interaction, those types of flavor kind of questions. And then you drill into like, well, what's the meaning? What are we trying to convey? How would we want to like roll that number up? How, like, does it make sense to do this? Like, what questions are we trying to answer? Like, you keep it high level and end user interactive focused, as opposed to, hold on, let me go create that object again, this visual, like here's how you click through the, it just, that's the way I feel about it.
Well,
I think the tools are more valuable than trying to do it in a dev tool, and Power BI Desktop, for all intents and purposes, is a dev tool.
I think the speed of which I can move around. So I definitely think there's a learning curve. Like, I feel like if you're starting out on Figma and XD, it feels slow and clunky. It's not as fast as you think. But once you start learning some shortcuts, I feel like much more like those tools are designed to create iterations quickly and fast. So I feel like those, for me, work really well when I'm trying to get my ideas out as quick as I can on a paper. Another one I'm really loving right now is Miro.
So let me ask them, what's the spectrum? Because we said it's not for every single use case, right, that we're going to be using a design tool like Figma. And I think I'll backtrack real quick. You said there are some very good areas where Figma or a design system really makes sense. Like, Mike, to your point, the buttons, some of those exterior designs, things that you can't just incorporate into Power BI without a lot more configuration. But the general visual feature set, so to speak, like where we're going to put our cards, where we're going to put a filter, the feature set of doing a drill through, I can use a demo data set. Everything that's exterior to a normal report, that's where maybe Figma kind of goes into play. So let me ask the question then, at what spectrum, where 0 to never, you never use Figma, to every single report we build, we're using Figma as a part of our scoping or our development process, where does it fit then?
So I would say places where Figma, I think, makes a lot of sense for users. I think it starts making more sense when you are building the high level templates, right? So if I'm talking like corporate templates, things that are going to be reusable multiple times, I think those things that's when I'm spending the extra time to do the design work. Another time I think that's very relevant to use that Figma, take that extra time or effort when you are developing with a designer. right? So there's a balance between what can Power BI do and what does the designer want. The designer wants everything to look great and clean and fancy and fast, like whatever that is. Like their thing, they design things that Power BI just cannot do. And the most struggle I've had designing reports is when a designer is involved and they don't understand the framework of Power BI. Therefore, they design things that are physically not possible. Like, hey, I want this table to have 2 rows of data in this single row of cells. Can't do it. That's a custom visual. So like they can design things, but we have to have a level of pushback to what we're doing. So I think, from my standpoint, like not talking about the visual themselves, but instead going in and being able to build the layouts, the backgrounds, where does the icons go? What are the sets of icons? What's the array of colors? I feel like those things are very appropriate for these tools and building corporate templates. The other example I have is when you're working on external facing reports. What do you think, Seth?
I agree.
Where do you use it?
Those are the two. So templates, like to like lay out, like what do we want to do? And this even goes into, colorizing per business unit, which is a big thing you like, Tommy, right? Like what is my color template? What are all the business units going to get? What is the design for each of these sets of reports? What is that? Like creating the consistent branding, right, for a particular work stream, because it like you got to get out of the framework of having every BI person that you have, Power BI folk, like developing a report in a different way. And the only way you do that is by creating consistency. You could do a template eventually, but that to initiate that full discussion, I think tools like Figma do a much better job. The second area is, I think I'd phrase it slightly differently than Mike. And I would say you use this when a company feels that the need for consistency and good user experience is worth the effort, right? Like, because this is added effort in the process to build and generate reports, and having those conversations with business leaders or whomever the audiences are around what the appropriate design is, what the intent, what questions you're trying to answer, like how do you design for that type of thing. And normally it's external facing, where a customer is interacting or paying for your building of that report, where that becomes very useful and is always part of the process, or should be always part of the process.
That makes sense.
So I'm hearing it, and this is absolutely not a volume issue where it's like if I'm not using it a lot, then it's not useful. But from what I'm hearing, at least from an in-house point of view, we're saying 10 to 20% of the time I'm building reports or doing something in BI, I'm using Figma.
10 to 20% of the time. It depends on your business.
I like how you put numbers on everything.
Of external.
I literally have
90% of my business could be external facing reports.
Okay, sure. And then you would, so in that case, you would use Figma each time.
100%.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I think it's use case based, not a percentage of how much often you use it. I think where I'm just trying to point out where I find the most value from that. When do I want to spend the extra time? Because regardless, at the end of the day, it's always extra time. It's always is.
Right.
And the more you do these things, the faster you become at them.
I know, 1,000%.
It's that, right? So it's like, is the ramp up to understand and learn these tools worth the squeeze if 90% of your time you're just doing ad hoc internal report and nobody cares what Power BI reports look like? Probably not, right? But in cases where but even then I could make an argument to the template usage, right? Like here, like you're talking about, how do we make sure that Power BI looks and feels the same way throughout an organization? I'd start with a tool like this, right? Because then I have the documentation. Like, this is what we have implemented. This is what you can expect as a user. Here's all the things that are in simple form of like, hey, I'm in sales. This is what my reports look like. Here's the layout and design that you're going to see consistently across the board, the look and feel, whatever the case may be. And that way you're also interacting with an audience that doesn't need to understand, like, okay, what's the difference between a Figma diagram that has all these images on it versus a PBIX file with 10 pages? They're going to be like, okay, I opened the PBIX. What now? They don't understand how those interact with each other.
To Mike's point, when this require a designer though? Especially if you're building a lot with Figma, or is this really just
the argument is BI folks should engage with these tools and learn them.
Mhm.
I like if we're talking, we're not even going to implement them across the board of all reports, then you're certainly not talking about adding a designer to the team,
Right.
right?
Mhm.
Like, however, I would say, for example, right now, the organization I work for have a lot of external facing customer reports. We have a UI UX team that works in the application and also spent a bunch of time in Figma building out what our reports should look like from the external application perspective, which changes the game completely, right? Because
Yes.
you also have opportunities to have these conversations that are not constrained by the developer of Power BI, but rather stress the importance of conveying information in such a way without the guardrails of the technical challenges you're going to face by them saying they want to see something in a certain way, right? Because Figma allows you to think about ideas and different ways to visualize things that aren't out of the box with Power BI. So you're conforming that discussion with things that are primarily going to be out of the box right out of the gate. And that shouldn't be part of that discussion in the beginning, I don't think. You want your report to do this thing. This is the interaction I expect on the page. I can't tell you how many fun times I've been interacted with design teams where they don't have those constraints, and it's 90% like, whoa, how are we going to do that? And we figure out a way to do it.
Right.
But 10% of the time, it's like we have a technical challenge. We just can't produce that, and then we have to
Yeah.
adjust. But at the same time, I'm not forcing like my view and what I understand about the visual lexicon that I am I know and is part of why my repertoire onto the business right away.
Right.
Right.
Mhm.
It should be the other way, which is this is the experience we're trying to create. Go make it happen. And then if we have technical challenges, then we address them at that point.
Mhm. And I think the only hesitation I have with the conversation up to this point is could be a little closed box mentality is if you either don't have the design team or you don't have the resources to create something that's out of the box in Power BI. And we're not just talking custom visuals. We are talking those exterior components, so to speak. You're kind of stuck. Or you're very limited if you don't have those resources available. You may have the greatest design that you developed in Figma, but it's just not technically possible with the resources available to you or your team.
Okay. So what's your argument?
Then the point, well, then I'm saying then the point of Figma is, or the point of this design system, why spending the time to develop something that you cannot replicate in the actual production development application, Power BI, right? If you don't have,
Yeah, but it's
That's why I said 90% of the time
Yeah.
it forced us to think outside the box, and
Yeah.
in some way, shape, or form brings to the conversation. And this is where designer UI UX people, if you can have
Right.
them,
if
is
yeah,
very useful because it forces you to think about the interactions of things in different ways
Yeah,
that
the
you're not
UI.
going to know or think about as a BI person. Like we can't know everything.
I mean,
Right.
some of us can't.
So your argument is
Tommy
like
already knows it all.
we're forced to analyze how we technically solve a a visual challenge.
sure.
Well, I mean, I agree with you, Seth, and I understand where you're going, Tommy. Like, I think your case here is very well made. Like, use desktop for more things. I get it, but I think you can get. I think us as designers, when I think about like listening to other MVPs or people talk about like working on things together in Power BI, I think I've heard a lot of other MVPs or other technical lead people say, I'm really good at building the model and the data and getting the visuals together. I'm very poor at doing the design and the graphics and the whatever else on that. So I feel like these tools that take you away from the Power BI desktop experience declutters my mind from the technical need of having to build measures and visuals and calculations. And I can focus on the UX, the feel. There's a lot of other touchy-feely kind of things that go along with this that are like, I don't know how you say it, like UI, like how does it make me feel? Like if I can do the 10,000 foot like zoom really far back and look at the the graphics, does this look appealing? And so, not to say that you shouldn't, I don't want to encourage people to do that. Well, I'll say this way. I don't want to encourage you to do this one, but I do think this is a factor that is factored in regardless. If you build an ugly looking report and it just doesn't look good, the data may be rock solid, but people won't engage with it.
Right.
They won't like it. As soon as you add some polish to it, even just a little minor amount of polish and some thought around the design and the UX of it, when you do that, you've already removed some friction from that user to like that report a little bit more. And not to say you need to cheat the data so that data is like junk and you have this great looking report, but it's something that you should definitely factor into the user experience of that report. And the more people that use that report, I think the more time you need to spend on the UI UX. It's a data app.
I think the balance or the struggle that I'm having is the art of the functional versus the art of the beautiful right now, which is kind of where to me the divide is I can build.
I don't agree.
All right.
I think what you're discounting is the whole point of the article, which is like the reason you would use this tool is because it forces you to not only be able to have those sorts of conversations, but to think about design and user experience and audience much more so and does in general. Why do you think we didn't waste? We invested years in like templates and layouts and all of these things because it's a weak spot for the BI developer, right? So it's not by any stretch of the imagination something that is just like it's prettifying, it's spending a bunch of time you don't need to. No, it's an area of expertise that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about at all, that designers and UI UX folks can talk ad nauseum about in how you would lay out a page much better than we could, because they know that their experiences with how people navigate and do things in applications is far beyond what we know from an introductory standpoint. We're data folks. We bring insights to people, and there are much better ways. I think this challenges at least me and the idea that Figma as a design tool and design discussions as it relates to how people are going to interface with our report should be in everything. It's not going to be, though, because we know it's not going to be.
And to an extent, I agree, but I think you look at the article, prototyping is essential for BI development as it allows developers to visualize data to users quickly. In my...
No. Read it like it's written. Design dashboards with user-friendly interfaces quickly. I think the emphasis here is interfaces.
Okay, if you can, but the goal there, if you can redesign it. So like I said, I think I'm going to backtrack here, or not backtrack, but take a step back in terms of the point of the prototype, the point of the wireframe, or the point of the sandbox is communicate to the user how this report's going to look, behave, what we're trying to communicate to them.
Sure.
And my simple argument here is Power BI, the canvas. I can take the demo data, because obviously we're not using real data in Figma either.
Okay.
And I can easily put together an idea without putting a lot of time into a Figma design, but do the layout, because I think that's the big part here. Like, what data is going to be presented where, change the titles here and there.
No. And you're talking about data. But to me, like, yes, I agree with you. If you're doing that kind of stuff, yes. But if I like where the menu lives, is the menu on the left-hand side? Is the menu on the top? What icons do I use? Like, Power BI is not good at those things.
Sure.
Shadows. Like, if you want to do a complex gradient across the background, if you want to put a transparent background so that the color pulls through.
Yeah, clickable things in Figma, right? Like in Power BI, you're going to spend a lot more time sticking around with properties to make sure that something looks and feels like a Figma diagram.
Yeah, and I do agree, for external customers, for larger projects, this is where Figma really shines, and it should be used. You cannot do that in Power BI, but I think 80% of the volume that I'm designing a report or brainstorming the idea of a new report, I think I can replicate that in the application itself outside of Figma.
So then the question becomes this, right? Like, the reason I say for large customers or templates is because if you tried to force a business to do this on every step for every report, you get shot down. You wouldn't be able to do it because it's a time sink.
Right.
Does that mean I don't think it's valuable? No. Like, I would actually say, you know what? In every report I'm generating, I'm skipping a bunch of steps, and I know that my end user, like, I'd have to sit down with them, talk them through this Figma thing. They don't care, right? Like, have all those design conversations, the UI, UX, like, but would it clarify a lot of things and maybe make the report usage a lot higher? Potentially, probably, right?
So let me give you another not a counterpoint, but let me be a side point to that one, and let's see how you guys react to this one. Imagine for me if there was a gallery of a bunch of these sample things, right? So
try again. Riddle me this.
Riddle me this.
Okay.
If you had a place where you could go and you could just browse hundreds of these things, right? Someplace I can go. So to me, like to your point, Seth, right? The time I need to build the Figma to get things to go, okay, probably problematic to some degree, right? You use things like Canva, or there's other like tools out there that let you just kind of like, hey, I'm just going to go pick some arbitrary good color palettes that match really well, good backgrounds or scrims or whatever that stuff is, right? So if you think about that, if there was a place where you could just browse through and see all these things pre-styled in a way that would be good, imagine for me a world where Power BI Desktop gave you this ability to like make a layout, and this is where the stuff sits on the page, and you just go pick it up, and just basically you don't tell the end user, you don't go to the end user and say, tell me what you want from scratch. You basically say, here's 3 options, here's 5 options, pick one. Pick the one that resonates with you the best. They meet company brand guidelines. They all have different patterns. Go pick one of the ones that you want, and that's what we work with. So I think to me, like the community is already building really good stuff. There's just a great way of collecting it in a way that is easy to consume in like my scenario. So to me, there's another whole idea, and that's what we've done with like theme generator. That's what we've done with the color gallery, right? These are things where the community is generating great content. You don't have to be an expert at it. You just can go show up and then pick things you like. So I think there's going to be more of that coming as this product continues to mature. We do the same thing with scrims and layouts. Like we have 2 products that we sell that are like addressing that need specifically. Hey, look, here's 17 different items you can go pick from. Look through all of these, pick the one you want. Okay, that's the one we want to go with. Great. Now we understand what you want as an expectation for an end user, and then you now have a talking point from where you're starting from. Oh, I don't like that menu bar. There's too many menus. We only need 3. We don't need 4. That stuff's easier to fix after the fact. But to have all the image and stuff up front, I mean, there's so many creative ways you can build this stuff.
And I think that's a good point, because the replication side that's the hardest thing. Like, what if you're doing it in a because Power BI is not intended to be a design tool. So like for Figma, like look what you can do with Power Apps now. I can literally take a notepad or a Figma design and literally upload that to Power Apps, and now I have a Power App. So there's a lot of fluidity between applications. But that does not exist.
And that's the thing.
Power BI. Right. And that's
imagine if I could do more of that. Imagine I could start with a place where like, so you can save a PBIT file of some stuff, but you don't get anything. There's no data. It doesn't wipe anything. It doesn't show you the report with just no data in it, which would be ideal to be able to take a PBIT file and say, I'm interested in looking at just the image of whatever that thing is. So yes, I agree with that. But I mean, that's where I think we go with a lot of this stuff, right? I mean, I think Microsoft has done a good job. I think there's a lot of people with having a lot of good ideas. But again, as we look about like data shapers, data modelers, there's a lot of good examples out there. We just don't have the library of creative content that we need to be able to produce what we want. So I think if it was easier for us to generate more creative content or have a way of sharing that created content that is creative, I think that would make things a lot easier, because then you could just start picking general templates, and it would greatly improve your build quality of reports very fast.
And I completely agree. One thing I want to explore when Seth comes back from the Matrix, or another topic, is I think to me a more powerful part for the business intelligence analyst or the person in BI, it's not so much using Figma from report design and getting stuck in that box, is the other things that the author talks about, and it's using Figma as a communication tool to the business for other ideas, for your documentation, for your personas. Like, hey, we need to create an infrastructure, or we need these resources, or you're working with your BI team on how do workspaces work. those types of things using Figma. Like developed something. I use a tool called Draw.io. It's it is for the
Yep,
engineer.
I
or
use
the
it too. It's
Yeah,
another good one.
but
Yep,
I use that like
that's a really good wireframing.
right. But I don't use that for design. I use that like we were showing like what gold data sets were, and like that idea of like how would this work, and basically building those blocks. To me, that's a more powerful feature for the BI to use more often than something like Figma to communicate different things the BI team's trying to do.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if you're using Figma. I mean, if
Right.
that tool works for you, then it works. Like,
Right.
but you're
Exactly.
conveying the same information. Like, it's the simplified, easy to use tool. You know, the idea here is it's faster to use these design tools than it is to use just straight up Power BI.
Yeah. So
That's
we'll save
really
that for
the principle there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do want to save that for another day, is using design, not just for visual design.
Yes, I think that
So,
totally makes sense.
But
well, I think it's probably a good time to wrap here. We have officially lost Seth. His connection has dropped or whatever that may be. So with that being said, we appreciate your time. We appreciate your thoughts on this episode around designing things, what to use. I guess I would say clearly, I would recommend you look into these other design tools and figure out how to use them, or work with designers who know how to use them and figure out how to incorporate it into part of your design process. Well, I hope you like this podcast. We appreciate your listenership. We thank you very much for participating and joining in. Sorry we're not there live this episode, but we will be back next week with a live episode for you, and we'll be able to join in the chat conversation and all the fun things. Tommy,
and it's
where
Christmas.
Else? Yes, Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
You can find the podcast anywhere it's available. Make sure to subscribe to all of the audio, Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Anchor, Overcast, all those things. If you want to join the conversation live, you can do so every Tuesday and Thursday. We have a great community, so you can chat with some really smart people. 7:30 in the morning, 8 Central on YouTube and LinkedIn.
Sounds good. Awesome. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. See you next time.